The room went silent the second Professor Harold Whitmore dropped the marker on his desk. He looked across the packed lecture hall, straight at the young man sitting alone in the last row. You! Every head turned. Marcus Johnson slowly looked up from his notebook. Since you seem so confident, the professor said with a thin smile, why don't you solve something the rest of this class couldn't? A few students exchanged nervous glances. Others smirked. Marcus had barely spoken all semester. He always arrived early, sat in the back, and left before anyone could start a conversation. Professor Whitmore walked to the whiteboard and began writing. The marker moved faster and faster. Symbols covered the board. Equations stretched from one side to the other. When he stepped back, nearly every student stared with wide eyes. Someone whispered, "That's impossible." Another muttered, "That's graduate level." Whitmore folded his arms. "Well, Marcus?" The classroom waited. Marcus stood without saying a word. He picked up a piece of chalk. And before anyone realized what was happening, he erased the professor's first line. A wave of gasps swept through the room. Whitmore's face hardened. "What exactly are you doing?" Marcus looked at him calmly. "I'm fixing the mistake." The room became so quiet. You could hear the air conditioner humming overhead. No one knew that this moment would uncover a story buried for nearly 20 years. Not even Marcus. Marcus Johnson wasn't the kind of student professors noticed. At least, that's what most people believed. He was 20 years old, tall and lean, with worn sneakers that had seen better days and a backpack held together by careful stitching. He worked nights unloading delivery trucks at a grocery warehouse. Most mornings, he barely slept 3 hours before catching 2 buses to Franklin State University. Coffee wasn't a luxury. It was survival. His classmates assumed he struggled because he looked exhausted. None of them knew exhaustion had nothing to do with intelligence. Every dollar Marcus earned helped pay rent for the tiny apartment he shared with his grandmother, Evelyn. She had raised him since he was 6 years old. She never complained about the arthritis in her hands. She never mentioned the pain in her knees. She simply smiled every morning and reminded Marcus to chase the future she never had. "You keep going," she always said while packing his lunch in an old paper bag. "I already lived my dream." Marcus always answered the same way. "No, Grandma. You gave me yours." She would laugh softly. "Then don't waste it." Those words stayed with him everywhere he went. Franklin State wasn't an easy place to disappear. Students competed over everything. Grades. Internships. Scholarships. Recognition. Professor Harold Whitmore sat at the top of that world. He was famous on campus. Brilliant. Demanding. Impossible to impress. His students often joked that getting a compliment from Whitmore was harder than passing his final exam. Whitmore believed one thing above everything else. Talent announced itself. If someone had real ability, they would prove it. Loudly. Marcus never did. That bothered him. Week after week, Whitmore watched Marcus solve homework perfectly but barely speak in class. Whenever discussions began, Marcus stayed quiet. Whenever students argued over proofs, Marcus simply listened. Whitmore started believing something. Maybe Marcus wasn't solving the work himself. Maybe someone else was helping. The thought settled into his mind like a stubborn stain. And once it was there, he couldn't shake it. Across campus, someone else had noticed Marcus. Professor Elena Brooks. She taught introductory engineering. Unlike Whitmore, she watched students when they didn't know they were being watched. She noticed Marcus staying after class to help another student understand fractions before moving into calculus. She noticed him returning borrowed textbooks exactly on time. She noticed him eating lunch alone while reading math journals far above undergraduate level. One afternoon she approached him outside the library. "Marcus?" He looked up. "Yes, Professor? I've been meaning to ask." She smiled. "Where did you learn mathematics like that?" Marcus hesitated. "My grandmother." Professor Brooks blinked. "She taught advanced mathematics?" Marcus laughed for the first time. No. Then who did? He looked toward the campus fountain. My grandfather. I thought your grandmother raised you. She did. Professor Brooks waited. Marcus shrugged gently. He died before I was born. She frowned. Then how? Marcus reached into his backpack. Carefully. He pulled out a faded notebook wrapped in clear plastic. The cover had almost disappeared beneath years of wear. Inside, every page was filled with equations, tiny notes, corrections, ideas written in blue ink. My grandmother gave this to me when I turned 12. Professor Brooks carefully flipped one page, then another. Her eyes widened. These weren't classroom exercises. They were original mathematical observations. Elegant, creative, beautiful. At the bottom of nearly every page, the same initials appeared. E.J. Who was E.J.? Marcus smiled. My grandfather. Professor Brooks slowly closed the notebook. Did he teach at a university? I don't know. You never asked? My grandmother doesn't talk about him much. There was no sadness in Marcus's voice. Only curiosity. Like someone reading the first chapter of a book with half its pages missing. Professor Brooks handed the notebook back. Take care of this. I always do. As Marcus walked away, she couldn't stop thinking about those initials. Something felt strangely familiar. She just couldn't remember why. The following Monday, Professor Whitmore entered his advanced mathematics lecture carrying a single folder. No textbook. No notes. Just the folder. Students immediately sensed something unusual. Whitmore looked around the room. I've reviewed your midterm exams. Nobody smiled. I expected better. Silence. Then his eyes landed on Marcus. Especially from students whose homework scores don't match their classroom participation. Marcus looked up. Several students shifted uncomfortably. Everyone understood what Whitmore was implying. Whitmore continued. Mathematics isn't about memorizing answers. It's about thinking. He paused. So today, he reached into the folder. We'll discover who can actually think. He removed one sheet of paper. This problem has never appeared in any textbook I've assigned. Students leaned forward. Whitmore smiled slightly. It was adapted from an old research discussion I attended many years ago. He wrote the first equation across the board. Then another. Then another. Within minutes, the board looked impossible. Students stared as though they were looking at another language. Even the strongest students lowered their eyes. Whitmore set the chalk down. If anyone solves this correctly, he glanced around the room, they'll receive an automatic A for the semester. Nobody moved. Not one hand went up. Whitmore nodded. As expected. Then he looked directly at Marcus. But perhaps, he smiled, our silent expert would like to try. Laughter spread across the classroom. Not cruel laughter. Nervous laughter. The kind people use when they don't want attention landing on them instead. Marcus slowly stood. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. He wasn't afraid of the equation. He was afraid of becoming the center of the room. He hated attention. Always had. His grandmother used to tell him why. The tallest tree catches the strongest wind. Marcus had never forgotten that. Still, he walked toward the board. Every step felt heavier than the last. Whitmore handed him the chalk. Take your time. Marcus studied the equation. Only a few seconds passed. Then something unexpected happened. He frowned. Not because it was difficult. Because something felt wrong. His eyes moved back to the very first expression. Again. Then the second. He quietly asked. Professor. Whitmore crossed his arms. Yes? Did you mean to write this term here? Whitmore looked annoyed. I wrote exactly what I intended. Marcus nodded respectfully. I don't think you did. A few students chuckled. Whitmore's face tightened. And why is that? Marcus gently raised the chalk. Without another word. He erased the very first line. Gasps filled the room. Whitmore took one sharp step forward. "What are you doing?" Marcus kept his voice calm. "If this stays..." He pointed at the erased section. "The problem has no consistent solution," someone whispered. "What?" Marcus rewrote a single symbol. Just one. Nothing else. Then he stepped aside. "You switched two variables." Silence. Professor Whitmore stared at the board. His confidence disappeared for the first time anyone had ever seen. He looked closer. Then closer still. His breathing slowed. Because Marcus was right. One tiny symbol. One nearly invisible mistake. And the impossible problem had never actually been solvable. The students looked from the board to the professor. No one spoke. No one even moved. But in the back of the room, Professor Elena Brooks had quietly stepped through the open classroom door after hearing the unusual silence in the hallway. She looked at the corrected equation. Then at Marcus. Then at Professor Whitmore. And in that single moment, she recognized something about the way Marcus had rewritten the proof. Not just the answer. Not just the method. The handwriting. The spacing. Even the way he boxed the final expression. It matched the faded notebook she had seen only days earlier. And suddenly, those two initials, E.J., finally came rushing back to her memory. Professor Elena Brooks didn't hear another word Professor Whitmore said. Her eyes stayed locked on the board. Not because of the answer. Because of the handwriting. Marcus didn't just solve the equation. He built it the same way someone else once had. Every symbol lined up with careful spacing. Every correction sat exactly where it belonged. Even the small box around the final expression looked familiar. It wasn't normal. It was a signature. A signature she hadn't seen in almost 20 years. Before she realized it, she whispered to herself, "It can't be." The bell rang. Students finally found their voices. "Did you see that?" He corrected the professor. "No way. I've never seen Whitmore speechless." Phones came out. Pictures of the whiteboard spread across campus within minutes. Marcus quietly returned the chalk and reached for his backpack. He only wanted to leave. But Professor Whitmore stopped him. "Mr. Johnson." Marcus turned. "Yes, Professor?" Whitmore looked at the board again before speaking. "You found an error." "Yes, sir." "And then solved the problem." Marcus nodded. "It made more sense after the correction." Several students laughed in disbelief. Whitmore didn't. He studied Marcus for another long moment. "Come to my office tomorrow morning." Marcus hesitated. "Am I in trouble?" "I haven't decided yet." The room fell quiet again. Marcus simply nodded. "I'll be there." He walked out before anyone could surround him with questions. Outside, cool autumn air filled the campus. Leaves drifted across the sidewalks. Students rushed between buildings. To everyone else, it was another ordinary afternoon. To Marcus, something felt different. Like he had stepped onto a road he couldn't leave. He didn't notice someone watching from across the courtyard. Professor Brooks. She waited until he disappeared before pulling out her phone. She searched one name. Edward Jameson. Nothing. She tried again. Dr. Edward Jameson, Mathematics. This time, old university records appeared. A faded faculty photograph loaded slowly on her screen. Her heart skipped. The man in the picture had Marcus's eyes. The same calm expression. The same thoughtful smile. She zoomed in. Below the picture were the words. Franklin State University. Department of Mathematics. Assistant Professor Edward Jameson. 1988 to 1993. Professor Brooks stared at the screen. Marcus wasn't carrying around random notes. He was carrying the work of a mathematician who had once taught at this very university. But why had nobody ever mentioned him? What had happened? That evening, Marcus finished unloading trucks just after midnight. His shoulders ached. His hands were covered in dust from heavy boxes. His supervisor tossed him a bottle of water. You looked distracted all night. Marcus smiled. Long day. You in college, right? Yeah. The older man nodded. My daughter quit after one semester. Marcus stayed quiet. The supervisor looked at him. Don't quit. Marcus laughed softly. I'm trying not to. After work, he caught the last bus home. The apartment lights were still on. His grandmother sat in her favorite chair with a blanket over her knees. She always waited until he came home. You ate? Marcus nodded. Mostly. She raised an eyebrow. Mostly? He smiled. I'll make a sandwich. She reached into the kitchen without standing. I already did. He laughed. You always know. I've been your grandmother a long time. Marcus sat beside her. For several minutes, either of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Finally, Evelyn noticed his expression. What happened today? Marcus looked at the floor. I embarrassed a professor. She chuckled. You. I didn't mean to. What happened? He explained everything. The impossible equation. The mistake. The classroom. The silence afterward. When he finished, his grandmother wasn't smiling anymore. Instead, she looked worried. Grandma? She forced another smile. What was the professor's name? Harold Whitmore. For the first time in years, the color drained from her face. She whispered so quietly Marcus almost missed it. Harold. Do you know him? She quickly shook her head. No. But Marcus knew that look. It was the same expression she wore whenever anyone mentioned his grandfather. Like a memory had opened that she wished had stayed closed. Before he could ask another question, she stood. I'm tired. Grandma. We'll talk tomorrow. She walked into her bedroom and gently closed the door. Marcus remained on the couch. Something wasn't right. Across town, Professor Whitmore sat alone inside his office. Stacks of research papers covered every desk. The corrected equation still sat on the whiteboard behind him. He stared at it. Again. And again. How had he missed such an obvious mistake? His phone buzzed. Professor Brooks. Harold. What is it, Elena? You need to tell me something. What? Do you remember Edward Jameson? Silence. Long silence. Whitmore slowly leaned back. I haven't heard that name in years. I think I just met his grandson. Whitmore closed his eyes. That's impossible. I don't think it is. No. His voice turned quiet. It can't be. You knew him, didn't you? Whitmore didn't answer. Instead, he walked to an old filing cabinet tucked into the corner of his office. The lowest drawer stuck halfway. He pulled harder. Inside sat dusty folders no one had touched for decades. He searched carefully. Then stopped. One faded file. The label barely readable. Edward Jameson. Whitmore didn't open it. He simply stared. His hands were shaking. The next morning, Marcus knocked on Professor Whitmore's office door. Come in. The office smelled like old books and fresh coffee. Whitmore motioned toward the chair. Sit. Marcus obeyed. Either of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Whitmore asked, Who taught you mathematics? My grandfather. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. I thought he died before you were born. He did. Then how? Marcus reached into his backpack and placed the old notebook on the desk. Whitmore froze. He recognized the cover immediately. The clear plastic wrap. The worn edges. Even the small stain near the bottom corner. His breathing changed. Where did you get this? My grandmother. Whitmore slowly reached toward it. Then stopped himself. May I? Marcus nodded. Whitmore opened the first page. Every memory he had buried came rushing back. Edward's handwriting. Edward's corrections. Edward's impossible habit of solving problems 3 different ways. Whitmore turned another page. Then another. His voice barely escaped. He kept this. Marcus frowned. You knew him. Whitmore looked up. We worked together. You were friends? Whitmore didn't answer. Marcus noticed. Instead, Whitmore quietly closed the notebook. Your grandfather was one of the most gifted mathematicians I've ever met. Marcus smiled. I wish I'd known him. Whitmore looked away. So do I. Before Marcus could ask another question, a loud knock interrupted them. Professor Brooks entered holding a thin folder. I found something. She placed the folder on the desk. Inside was an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, Young Professor Resigns After Research Controversy. Marcus leaned forward. Below the headline, a photograph. His grandfather. Younger. Confident. Standing beside another man. Marcus looked closer. His stomach tightened. The second man was a much younger Harold Whitmore. Marcus looked from the newspaper to Whitmore. Back again. What happened? Neither professor answered. Professor Brooks finally broke the silence. The university archives are incomplete. What does that mean? She took a slow breath. It means somebody removed most of the records. Marcus blinked. Removed them? Whitmore lowered his head. Not somebody. His voice sounded heavy. The university. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. Why? Whitmore looked at the old photograph. Because after that article. He stopped speaking. Marcus waited. So what happened? Whitmore finally met his eyes. The official story, he said quietly, wasn't the truth. The room became still. Marcus felt every question he'd carried since childhood pressing against his chest. His grandfather had taught here. His notebook contained ideas professors still admired. His records had vanished. And now, one of the men who knew him was sitting only a few feet away, looking like he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Whitmore reached for the old file in his desk. His hand rested on it. But he didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he looked at Marcus and said, If you're willing to hear everything. He swallowed hard. You may never see this university the same way again. Whitmore stared at the old file for a long time. His fingers rested on the cover, but he couldn't bring himself to open it. Marcus waited. Professor Brooks stayed silent. Outside the office, students hurried between classes, laughing as they crossed the courtyard. Inside, the room felt frozen in time. Finally, Whitmore took a slow breath. I've lived with this for 20 years. He opened the file. The first page was a faculty photograph. Edward Jameson stood in the center, smiling with the confidence of a man who loved teaching more than anything else. Marcus couldn't look away. It was the first clear picture of his grandfather he had ever seen. He looks, Marcus whispered. Like you, Professor Brooks finished. Whitmore nodded. He was brilliant. But that wasn't what made people respect him. He looked directly at Marcus. It was his character. Whitmore pulled out another document. This was our biggest project. Marcus studied the page. Dozens of handwritten formulas filled the margins. At the bottom were two names. Edward Jameson. Harold Whitmore. You worked together. We did. What happened? Whitmore closed his eyes. We were competing for one permanent research position. The university only had funding for one professor. Marcus stayed quiet. The committee wanted results. Fast. Whitmore's voice grew heavier. Edward found something remarkable. He tapped the notebook Marcus had brought. Most of it is in there. Marcus looked down at the faded cover. My grandmother never told me. She was protecting you. From what? Whitmore looked away. From me. The words hung in the room. Professor Brooks slowly sat down. Even she hadn't expected that answer. Whitmore continued. I made the biggest mistake of my life. Years earlier, the university had been preparing for a national mathematics conference. Edward had spent months developing a new proof. Not because he wanted fame. because he believed it could help future researchers solve problems faster. Whitmore had admired him. He had also envied him. The committee compared everything we did, Whitmore admitted. Every lecture, every paper, every discovery. And I started believing that if Edward succeeded, I would disappear. Marcus watched him carefully. So what did you do? Whitmore's shoulders dropped. I questioned his work. You thought it was wrong? No. The answer came instantly. I knew it was right. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Whitmore continued. I told the committee there were errors that needed to be investigated. Professor Brooks looked stunned. You delayed the review. Whitmore nodded. The conference deadline passed. The funding disappeared. The university cancelled Edward's appointment. Marcus stared at him. You knew he was innocent. I did. Then why didn't you tell the truth? Whitmore looked at the floor. Because every day that passed, it became harder. The room fell silent. I kept telling myself I'd fix it tomorrow. But tomorrow became another week. Then another month. Eventually, he resigned. Marcus felt anger building inside him. My grandfather lost his career. Whitmore nodded. Because I was afraid. Marcus stood and walked toward the window. Outside, students filled the sidewalks. Young people chasing dreams. Exactly as his grandfather once had. Without turning around, Marcus asked quietly. Did he ever hate you? Whitmore's answer surprised everyone. No. Marcus turned. What? Whitmore opened another envelope. Inside was a folded letter. The day he left campus. He handed this to me. Whitmore unfolded the paper with shaking hands. I've read it hundreds of times. His voice cracked as he read. Harold, if you're reading this, then I've already packed my office. I know you spoke against my research. I knew before anyone else. Marcus blinked. He knew. Whitmore nodded without speaking. He kept reading. You made a terrible mistake. But I hope one day you become the teacher your students deserve. Because fear is a poor guide for a brilliant mind. Don't waste the years you have left trying to protect your reputation. Use them helping someone else become greater than you. That will be enough. The room was completely still. Whitmore folded the letter carefully. I never answered him. Marcus's eyes drifted toward the notebook again. Every late night. Every page. Every lesson. His grandfather had never taught him with words. He had taught him through patience. Through kindness. Through work. Whitmore reached into the file one final time. There is one more thing. He placed the sealed envelope on the desk. The university archives didn't destroy everything. Marcus slowly opened it. Inside was a recommendation letter. Signed by Edward Jameson. Addressed to the university president. Marcus frowned. This is dated 3 days before he resigned. Whitmore nodded. Read the last paragraph. Marcus swallowed. If my position is eliminated, I strongly recommend Harold Whitmore for the permanent faculty appointment. Marcus looked up in disbelief. He recommended you? Whitmore couldn't hold back his tears anymore. He knew exactly what I'd done. And he still wanted me to succeed. No one spoke. Professor Brooks quietly wiped away a tear. Marcus looked at the photograph of the two young professors standing side by side. One had been consumed by fear. The other had answered betrayal with grace. Only one of them had truly won. 3 weeks later. The university auditorium was completely full. Students. Faculty. Alumni. Retired professors. News reporters. Word had spread quickly. Franklin State University was making a public announcement. The university president stepped onto the stage. For many years, we celebrated an incomplete history. He paused. Today, we correct it. A large screen lit up behind him. Edward Jameson's photograph filled the room. Many older professors lowered their heads. Some remembered. Others wished they had. The president continued. After reviewing newly recovered records, The university recognizes that Professor Edward Jameson's research met the highest academic standards. His voice echoed across the auditorium. His resignation resulted from failures within this institution. We cannot change the past, but we can tell the truth. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Marcus looked toward the front row. His grandmother sat quietly with tears running down her face. She wasn't crying because the university had apologized. She was crying because someone had finally said Edward's name with honor. The president smiled gently. We are also establishing the Edward Jameson Scholarship. It will support students who demonstrate extraordinary ability, humility, and perseverance regardless of financial background. The applause grew even louder. Then the president looked toward Marcus. And the first recipient has already inspired this campus. Marcus slowly stood. The entire auditorium applauded. Not because he had embarrassed a professor. Not because he had solved an impossible equation. But because he had reminded everyone that greatness doesn't always sit in the front row. Sometimes, it quietly carries a worn backpack. After the ceremony ended, students crowded around Marcus. Some wanted pictures. Others wanted advice. One nervous freshman finally asked, "Were you always this good at math?" Marcus smiled. "No. So how did you become amazing?" Marcus looked at the old notebook in his hands. "I kept learning from someone who believed knowledge should be shared." The freshman nodded. "I hope I'm that good someday." Marcus handed him a blank sheet of paper. "Start here." The student looked confused. Marcus laughed. "Every expert starts with an empty page." Across the courtyard, Whitmore watched the conversation. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need recognition anymore. Professor Brooks walked beside him. "You finally did what Edward asked?" Whitmore smiled sadly. "I should have done it 20 years ago." "You couldn't. But you did today." Whitmore nodded. "And Marcus?" Professor Brooks looked across the lawn. Marcus was sitting beneath an old oak tree, patiently explaining a problem to 3 first-year students. She smiled. "I think Edward became the teacher he hoped to be." Whitmore followed her gaze. "No." He shook his head gently. "I think he simply taught through the next generation." The afternoon sun drifted through the branches. Marcus opened the faded notebook one more time. Tucked inside the back cover was a page he had somehow never noticed. The paper had been folded so tightly that it blended into the binding. Carefully, he unfolded it. In his grandfather's familiar handwriting were just 2 short lines. "If you're reading this, you solved the problem that mattered most." Marcus smiled through tears. He closed the notebook, looked toward the sky, and whispered the words he had wished he could say his whole life. "Thank you, Grandpa?" For the first time in decades, Edward Jameson's legacy no longer lived inside a forgotten notebook. It lived in every student who believed that true brilliance isn't measured by applause or titles, but by the lives you lift after you're gone. And this time, the classroom didn't fall silent because someone had been humiliated. It fell silent because the truth had finally found its voice.